When the Night Comes Out presents The Hive, Part 2. Seven o'clock arrived, and the men who were not still on guard duty all filed into the conference room. When Kettinger arrived, he felt a moment of stage fright seeing the amount of people who had shown up. More than just the guards were here, confirming that the transfer of Dalton King was a concern for more than just guards and prison staff. He saw that some of the residents of Hive City had shown up to hear this. There was none of the joking and chatter that usually went with these kinds of meetings. His men were generally a good-humored sort who would toss insults around and joke all the time. Now, each of the guards sat stoic and still. Everyone was deadly serious. Kettinger strode into the room, trying his best to look completely calm and in charge. He cleared his throat, and it seemed, at least to him, to echo around the hall. Certainly, he mused to himself, that was some acoustic illusion. The room wasn't that big. His mind was wandering, something that it did when he was nervous, and he gave out a small cough and shook his head a bit to clear it. He had to focus. He reached the podium at the front of the room. Reg was right in the front row, and he and Kettinger exchanged their customary nods to each other. Behind Kettinger was a large white screen with the name Dalton King in large black letters across it. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Kettinger began after taking a sip of water from a bottle that Jenny had placed beneath the top of the podium. "I didn't quite expect so many of you, but I certainly understand why all of you are here. I guess you all know that Dalton King arrives here tomorrow to begin the rest of his life essentially buried and forgotten. We have a special cell waiting for him on the lowest levels. He will not be a part of our mining operations and will have very, very limited access to anything outside of that cell. For most of you, that's a punishment that you can not only understand, but support. However, many of you also have families here and are wondering what is going to happen to prevent any kind of catastrophe tomorrow. That is what I'm here to go over." He picked up a small remote and hit a button, and the slide behind him on the screen changed. Now the screen showed schematics of the hive, the shaft, and had colors highlighting various routes around the hive. Now, this is the plan. Dalton King will be heavily sedated with a steady IV before he even leaves his current prison location. He will be strapped to a gurney after being strapped into a straitjacket, complete with a mask, just like that movie from the 20th century. His legs will be shackled, his hands bound, and he will then be loaded into a heavily armored truck that will contain 10 heavily armed guards. There are 6 identical trucks that will leave the prison and head in different directions. Each truck is accompanied by a convoy of 20 trucks, including armed personnel carriers. These carriers have the latest in sonic technology that will seek out and detonate any improvised explosive devices that might be planted along the route. The task is to keep Dalton King sedated until he arrives in his cell. There will be a doctor and a nurse with him to make sure he stays alive. The government wants to be sure that their prize trophy gets where they say he will be alive. Once he gets here, he will be met by another contingent of 50 armed guards and will be offloaded from the truck still strapped to his gurney and still sedated. Kettinger clicked through one slide after another. He paused to look out over his audience. They were all in rapt attention. The armed guards will strap a belt to him at that point that, should he become aware and awake and cause trouble, that will send an electrical charge through his body that should render him completely useless. Hopefully, however, the sedation medication will still be in full effect and he will be unconscious. He will then be brought down the shaft and go through the various stages we all go through when we come down to this depth. Once he reaches the bottom, a large contingent of our own guards, all of them armored and carrying weapons, will meet the party from the surface. All of them will then lead him, completely surrounded, down the various levels to a cell. It is at this point that the most critical part of the operation will happen. We have to remove King from the gurney and unshackle him and get him onto the bed inside his cell. As I've mentioned several times, he's supposed to be sedated, so he won't be able to walk into the cell like most prisoners. Our guards will have to carry him, set him on the bed, and then back out of the cell. This should all be quick, and there should be no incident because of the medication. However, he will either be shocked or shot if anything does happen. Surrounded by so many guards and buried as far below the surface as he will be, there will be very little Dalton King can do to try and escape. A hand shot up from somewhere in the middle of the room. Yes? What if he has no desire to escape? He just wants to kill people. Kettinger cleared his throat again. We all know what Dalton King is about. There's no denying that there is risk with him being here. We're not allowed to keep him sedated the entire time. However, this cell has extra security. The entire floor, walls, even the ceiling, sink, and toilet are ready to send volts through him if he should get rowdy. There are anesthetic gas tubes that will fill his cell with knockout gas if need be. He will be allowed only 1 hour outside of his cell a day, and that will be to a small yard located just behind his cell. He will be fed in his cell. He will have no visitors. He is allowed to shower just 1 day a week, and that has also been built adjacent to his cell. His entire life, after tomorrow, will be hundreds of feet beneath the surface, inside a space that is less than most city apartments. Kettinger scanned the crowd, allowing that to sink in. Their faces showed the respect he was hoping for. Tomorrow, we will transfer him to the cell, get him onto that bed, and then get him unshackled. Our men have been training, getting that done in seconds rather than minutes, and then they will back out of the cell, and Dalton King will be locked down. He will then become, for all intents and purposes, a non-entity. He will be alive, but buried. Kettinger paused again to take another sip of water. I know that many of you are nervous. I understand. I am too. However, everything that we can think of to make this uneventful has been thought of and enacted. We all want our families protected, our loved ones protected, and to get back to our normal daily activities as soon as possible. Kettinger let his eyes wander, meeting the gazes of several of the audience. They still looked scared, but not quite as scared as they looked when he first arrived in the room. If you have questions, I'm available. Reg is also available, and he's been briefed on everything that I just said. In fact, all of our guards have been. I had called this meeting originally more as a way to reinforce what they already knew and answer any questions they might have had. But now that so many of you from Hive City are here, we can help answer any questions you might have too. Thank you for your time. Kettinger closed his notebook, and the screen went dark. Kettinger shifted from one foot to the next, his heart pounding and his palms sweating. What was taking so long? Yes, it took time to get down the shaft, but it was taking much too long. When he arrived in his designated spot, he thought he was projecting the right amount of cool and expertise about the situation. With each passing moment, that cool was breaking. Just to accentuate that point, he raised his arm and wiped it across his forehead, and then sighed at the amount of sweat that came away. This is taking a lot longer than it should, Reg muttered to Kettinger's right. Reg always had a knack for saying out loud the things that Kettinger was thinking. You read my mind, Kettinger replied out of the side of his mouth. The day had started normally, if a bit tense. There was tension in the air. The normally relaxed attitude that Kettinger had when driving his cart into the prison had been replaced with a strange formality and awkwardness. Despite being so far beneath the ground, it felt like the eyes of the entire world were peering down on all of them. Not only was King coming, but the world wanted to be sure he got here and got locked up without incident. It was exactly the wrong kind of atmosphere for something this potentially dangerous. All of his men had been at their assigned posts. Most of the administrative staff was also at work, despite the fact that there wasn't much need for them to be at their desks any earlier than normal. Everyone wanted to see what was going to happen. Even the prisoners inside the hive were at their cell doors, pressing their ears up against them and sending signals through the walls through their complicated Morse code to try and get news to each other about what was happening. The guards lined the walkway leading from the massive elevator that led up the shaft. They were all dressed in their cleanest uniforms. Although Kettinger had been assured that the media would not be allowed to tape the transfer, most of the staff down here thought that video or photographs would end up being taken and shown around the world. No one wanted to look shabby. Right now, however, Kettinger saw that his men were all sweating, all nervous, and all shifting from one foot to the other. This is not good, he thought. The more we have to wait, the more keyed up they get, and the more likely a mistake could be made. Kettinger had been told that he would be getting regular information via an earpiece from the surface. He had heard word hours ago that the convoy and its cargo had arrived. Kettinger held off telling the men, knowing that the shaft moved slowly to allow the bodies of those inside of it to accept the change in atmosphere and atmospheric pressure down here. However, when they gave the word, and these men had responded, it shouldn't have been more than a half hour before the elevator opened. There had been no further word from the surface since. Kettinger was just about to give up and head back to his office to use the phone when the shaft suddenly emitted a loud hum. All of the guards knew that noise. The elevator was moving, and it was getting close. Kettinger nodded, and all of his men armed themselves. The moment seemed to stretch for hours. The sound became like a drill, slowly boring into Kettinger's brain. More sweat ran in rivulets down his face, down his back, and even down his legs. His heart pounded like a jackhammer in his chest. Kettinger looked down just for a moment to confirm that his heart was still inside his chest. Yes, good, there it was. The sound grew louder and louder. Dust blew out from the crack in the elevator door as it grew closer to the bottom. Light emitted from the crack shortly thereafter. There was a loud sound like something landing. And then the door slid open. Kettinger tensed further. His guards did as well. The military guard emerged from the elevator. One after another, men dressed in full armor and carrying some of the biggest guns Kettinger had ever seen marched out in steady order. They marched past the guards, not wavering in their gaze, giving no sign that anything was wrong. They all waited, as if watching a parade. Then suddenly the medical staff and the man in charge of the transfer emerged. Kettinger had spoken to the man 4 times since this whole move had been decided upon. He was a weasel of a man named Dix. He stepped forward, looking ill, his thinning hair plastered to his shiny dome with sweat. His eyes darted left and right. Kettinger knew right away what was happening. Dix freaked out, Kettinger thought. He's still freaking out. The depth and the pressure is too much for him, and he's cracking. Shit, we have to get him out of here fast. Kettinger stepped forward and strode up to Dix. The man nearly jumped out of his suit when Kettinger approached. Kettinger reached out his hand, and Dix shook it weakly. The man's hands were slippery. "Welcome to the Hive," Kettinger said. "I'm Kettinger. We've spoken on the phone. I trust that everything is in order?" Dix nodded and then seemed to remember where he was and what his responsibilities were. He stood up straighter and fixed his tie. "Yes, everything went well," Dix said. "We had quite a crowd in the elevator." Ah, Kettinger thought. Dix is a bit claustrophobic. "I'm glad you made it," Kettinger said. "Shall we complete this so everyone can get back to their regular lives?" "Of course," Dix said, running his hand through what hair he had. Dix stepped aside. Kettinger looked back over his shoulder and saw 2 doctors dressed in white coats and 3 nurses. Between them all was a man strapped to a basic hospital gurney. Kettinger gasped despite himself. This was his first look at Dalton King in person. What amazed him at first was that the man was so much shorter than he thought. It was a bit tough to judge his actual height given that he was laying down, but it looked more like a teenager strapped to the gurney than the terror of the modern world. King's eyes were closed, and there was a metallic mask strapped to his face, covering his mouth and nose. 2 holes over the nostrils allowed for air. It looked anything but comfortable. Kettinger turned to the doctor. He was a man about the same size as Kettinger, with brown hair. He had seen photos that King usually wore wire-framed glasses. He also had a long nose that curved downward, and one of those faces that made him look like he was constantly sucking on a lemon. Kettinger could see none of that with the mask on. He wondered what his bedside manner was like. The man looked like he thought all of this was nonsense and that it was far, far beneath him to be involved. "Thank you for your help, Doctor," Kettinger said. "Lewiston," the man said, as if Kettinger had been asking what his last name was. "Dr. Lewiston, thank you," Kettinger said. "You are most welcome," Lewiston said. "He is fully sedated and should be out for another several hours. It took quite a bit to get him to go down. The man has a remarkable constitution." Kettinger nodded, then turned back to Dix. Dix looked like he was about to have a full freakout. The man kept staring up at the ceiling, as if he was feeling the full weight of the earth that was piled above them. Kettinger let his eyes slide sideways and catch Reg's gaze. There was an almost psychic exchange between them, and Reg stepped forward. In an instant, he had fastened the electricity belt to Dalton King's waist. King looked as limp as a rag doll. Then Reg stepped back and looked at his men. "All right, men, let's get this prisoner to his cell," Reg announced, and the guards immediately turned as one to face either right or left, depending on which side of the walkway they were standing. Kettinger took a spot near the foot of the gurney. The soldiers had already taken up spots ahead of the troop of guards and were waiting. The nurses and orderlies began to push the gurney. They walked at a steady pace, not rushing, but not dawdling either. The gurney had a squeaky wheel that started to get on Kettinger's nerves. "How deep are we?" Dix asked. "Very deep," Kettinger said, his eyes scanning left and right, confirming that his men were in step and moving the right way. They were getting near the spiraling walkway that would take them past the cells. That day, it had been decided that the Hive would shut down all mining operations until King was safely tucked away. That was to limit the number of people who would be walking through the halls and reduce the risk that King and his entourage might run into someone. The civilian mining operators were encouraged to stay home with their families. The prisoners were all locked down in their cells. "Is there a risk of a cave-in?" Dix persisted, wiping his forehead. "No," Kettinger said. "They used lasers to cut out this section of the earth. They used other technology to offer support, but there are already caves down here that have stood up to earthquakes and the movement of the planet without a cave-in." Kettinger let his gaze meet Dix. The man was getting closer to panic. "We're as safe as we can be," Kettinger reassured. "Mr. Dix, perhaps you'd like to go and wait for me in my office? I can probably spare one of my men who can show you the way if you like. You can have a drink, maybe lay down. You look exhausted." Despite his attempt to be as tactful as possible, it was obvious from his reaction that Kettinger had just insulted Dix. The man flustered and stammered for a moment. Kettinger thought the man might burst a vessel. "I am perfectly capable of performing my duties, Mr. Kettinger," Dix finally said. "You need not worry about me. I've been instructed to see Dalton King to his cell and report back, and that is what I intend to do." "I didn't mean any insult," Kettinger said, keeping his voice even and his face calm. "I just wanted to extend the courtesy." Dix cleared his throat and looked straight ahead. Kettinger quickly tried to change the subject and maybe put the man at ease. "We have an entire community just outside the prison walls," he said. "We have houses, stores, a movie theater. We even have a bowling alley and a miniature golf course. I hear they plan on putting in a go-kart track next year. We have about 100 families, give or take. Dick straightened his tie. That's amazing. I can't believe that you have all of this here, a whole city beneath the ground. Kettinger nodded and resumed his scanning from left to right. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye and turned his head to the left, studying King's prone body. No, it was just a trick of the light. We even grow our own food using hydroponic technology and some other things with names and words that are twice as long, Kettinger said. We have corn, soybeans, and more. The nature of the crops changes all the time, and the technology improves and allows us to grow new things. I told them I'd love for them to figure out a way to grow apples down here, and I'm told they're working on it. Dick smiled and looked back at Kettinger. Whatever it was about the things Kettinger was saying, it appeared to be reassuring Dick's. The man had stopped sweating. Do you get first-run movies? Dix asked. Kettinger smiled. Thanks to the digital delivery systems, we do. They had reached the end of the guards and were now walking past the soldiers. Both the guards and soldiers now began moving in columns on either side of the walkway. Kettinger watched them. Both the guards and the soldiers had looks that could have melted ice. They were all keyed up and ready for anything. Kettinger looked at Dalton King. The man's eyes were closed, and a small monitor hooked up beneath the gurney showed his heartbeat as steady, but slow. The chains that held him down looked thick and sturdy. They finally entered the walkway, where there were cells along one side. Although all of the glass had been obscured so that no one inside could look out, Kettinger could sense that there were men on the other side of the doors with their ears pressed up against them. He could almost hear the tapping on the walls and pipes that would signal things to other prisoners in other cells. Every prison had a way to communicate, a secret code, and methods of getting word from one prisoner to the next. Even the supermax prisons on the surface had developed signs, signals, and ways to communicate. Despite the precautions in the Hive to keep the prisoners isolated when they were not working, Kettinger and the guards knew that true isolation could drive a man insane. They had long ago broken the codes and could understand what they were saying to each other easily. As soon as they crossed over the threshold into the prisoner area, the tension ratcheted up another notch. Kettinger sensed that even his guards were more tense. Kettinger looked behind and saw that the doctor was looking down at the monitors that were relaying King's vital signs. The female nurse to the doctor's left stared ahead of herself impassively. The orderlies also looked like they were actually quite bored with this whole scenario. From what Kettinger had been told, the events leading up to this had been uneventful. It was a long trip from the prison that had been holding King to the Hive. These soldiers and orderlies and doctors were all tired. Kettinger kept his face stoic, but inside he was frowning and worried. The doctor, the nurse, the orderlies were not made for this kind of thing. They would be tired, and when you were this tired, mistakes could be made. Why hadn't he thought about that before? He could have insisted that those from the surface head to the administration building and rest rather than make this journey. Kettinger had medical staff of his own who could have been monitoring the vitals. Hell, he had a fully functioning hospital in the Hive. Kettinger gave Reg a signal to indicate that things needed to move just a little bit faster. Reg waved a finger at Kettinger, acknowledging that he had received the message. Reg then gave another hand signal to his men. Let's see what we can do about getting this over with faster, shall we? Kettinger said. Dix nodded and looked relieved. The doctor, however, looked surprised, but also gave his consent. The orderlies began pushing the gurney much faster. Dick seemed to have calmed down, which was good, since Kettinger wanted to concentrate on what was going on around him. They all began walking much faster, at a decent clip, and were suddenly descending the long spiral much faster. The cell doors along the left side drifted past much faster. The eyes on the other side of those doors bore through the metal and glass, and Kettinger felt like they were boring right into the back of his neck. Kettinger had made it a point to greet and speak to every single prisoner inside the hive. All of them arrived nervous or outright terrified, which was fully understandable. Kettinger reassured them, told them that they would be taken care of, and then gave them a kind of brief orientation. While most of them were still terrified when they got to their cells, there had been very few incidents of prisoners reacting badly once they were processed. Kettinger tried to keep a good relationship with the people incarcerated here. They had to live together, perhaps for the rest of their lives, and there was no good way to get help. Kettinger felt that he had earned a bit of respect among the inmates here. He was fair, meted out punishment carefully, and was not considered a tyrant. If he had to enact something like this lockdown, he conveyed his reasons for it before doing it. And yet, when the man himself was here, when Dalton King was being pushed past your cell just a few feet beyond thick, reinforced glass, it was hard not to be tense. Kettinger had been in prisons before, and there was always a tension, like electricity in the air just before a thunderstorm broke, in the air before a riot, fight, or some kind of prison break attempt happened. You learned to sense it, feel it, and react to it. Kettinger could tell that Reg was feeling that right now as well. The minutes once again were stretching into hours. Normally, Kettinger enjoyed walking the hallways in the hive. He got a chance to chat with prisoners, see how things were developing, and how the hive itself was changing and adapting to life in general. He felt pride in the effectiveness of the prison. Now, he just wanted this to be over. "Is he still out cold?" Kettinger asked the doctor. "Yes," Lewiston replied. "He's out cold. Vital signs are good." Kettinger did not react to that. He sighed, breathing deep, trying to calm himself. He looked over at Dix, and the man was starting to sweat with each level they went down further. It took only about 10 minutes for them to make it halfway down. It felt like hours. That feeling of being watched was worse.
"Hey, King, get up!"
Kettinger jumped. It had come from one of the cells. It was followed by a flurry of pounding fists on the cell door. The beat of that pounding was taken up by the other prisoners on the level. Soon, it sounded like a number of tribal drums all pounding at once. More shouting, more pleas for King to awaken, were taken up. These were then matched by other shouts from other levels, from prisoners telling the ones who started it to shut up. Kettinger did not hesitate. He reached down to his belt and grabbed his communicator. "Bring down level 5. Seconds later, there was the sound of a soft hissing that managed to drown out the shouting. This was followed by more yelling, and then the sound of coughing. Moments later, all was quiet. "That was efficient," Dick said, wiping more sweat from his eyes. "I wish we had that at my prison." "When you're this far underground, you have to restore order fast," Kettinger said. "You can't call in the National Guard or anything. I can also administer medication to them remotely, if need be. This was just the fastest way." Dick smiled. Kettinger was beginning to dislike this man. Finally, after what seemed like a trek to match the Israelites wandering in the desert, they reached the bottom level. They were now far, far, far below the surface of the earth. Kettinger looked up and saw the hive stretching far above him. The only thing deeper than this were the mines. They reached King's cell. It was just like all of the others, but there was reinforcement to the glass. The cell had extra nozzles to spray the gas and more monitors hidden throughout the walls and ceiling to monitor his every move. The bed was made out of stone, attached to the wall and covered with a foam mattress. Everything else was bolted or welded down to prevent him from removing anything and turning it into a weapon. The entire column stopped moving. Kettinger could hear the breathing of all of the men and soldiers. Kettinger turned and faced the gurney, looking down again at the body of Dalton King. The man appeared to still be sleeping contentedly. "Are we ready?" Kettinger asked. Reg gave a nod. "Let's do it," Kettinger said. Reg and 4 of his hand-picked men stepped forward. One of the biggest, Kettinger was having trouble remembering his name right now, Stephen? Lord, he was so nervous. Stepped up and lifted Dalton King off the gurney like he was a rag doll. The other men took up positions around him, and then all of them moved steadily and slowly into the cell. Dr. Lewiston trailed after, along with his 2 nurses, making sure that the wires from the monitor and the sedative feed did not get tangled. The group managed to finagle their way into the cell. The burly man holding King settled the man on the foam mattress. Then he stepped away. Dr. Lewiston then stepped forward and checked the various vital signs on the terrorist, and then removed the tube feeding the sedative, and then all of the monitors. He stepped away from King and handed the tubes and other equipment to one of his nurses. Lewiston stepped up and leaned against the wall on the far side of the cell from King, his hands in his pockets, fidgeting. Reg stepped up next. He had keys and began removing the shackles, the straitjacket, and then the metal mask over the man's face. Now, Dalton King's face was visible to Kettinger for the first time. He looked normal. There was nothing evil in the man's countenance. There was nothing in the way the nose was shaped or the way the eyes looked that indicated to Kettinger that this was a man who had killed or ordered killed millions of people. His face was slack while sleeping, his cheeks white, his eyes shut tight. He looked like a kid, someone you could live next door to and say hello to every morning on your way to work and not think twice about it. Kettinger supposed it was this that made him so dangerous. You never thought about him, and he used that to his advantage to sneak into places and plant explosives, or get away from scenes where hundreds lay dead without anyone noticing. If any witness had actually seen him, he would have been hard to describe since he looked like everyone else. All that remained now was the electricity belt. That would stay on for a while until everyone was sure that Dalton King did not want to start trouble and fully understood the situation he was in. Reg stepped back and then out of the cell, holding all of the various instruments of imprisonment that had restrained Dalton King. He handed them off to one of his men. There were 3 guards inside the cell, plus Dr. Lewiston and his 2 nurses. The large man, Don, Kettinger thought, that man's name is Don something, who had carried King into the cell, leaned down to check something on King's body. The other 2 were looking back at Reg for the signal to get out of the cell. Kettinger turned to face Dix. A smile was spreading across the man's face. All of the tension and all of the worry, and it had been a non-event. A couple of prisoners got a little rowdy, but had been taken care of fast. Kettinger was about to open his mouth to speak to Dix and tell the man that all was well, when something out of the corner of his right eye caught his attention. Kettinger turned his head, but already felt like he was moving in slow motion. To his surprise, it was Lewiston that was moving. Kettinger was baffled by this, and then thought maybe King was having a heart attack or something. But no, Lewiston was removing his hand from his coat pocket. It took Kettinger just a moment to realize that Dr. Lewiston held a syringe. In an instant, the needle was plunged into the large guard's neck. "What the fuck?" Dix said. The big man reacted fast, swinging his arm around and catching Dr. Lewiston in the chest, sending him flying across the cell to collide with the wall he had previously been leaning against. Then the big man held his hand up to his neck and removed the syringe. He held it for a moment, looked up at Kettinger, and then fell face first on the floor. That was when Dalton King sat up on his bed. His eyes were open wide, the dark pupils also wide, giving him an odd look like he had doll's eyes. He also had a smirk on his face. Then he was up, on his feet, faster than the eye could follow. The other 2 guards reacted, and they reacted fast, bringing up their guns, but Dalton King was faster. He held a small blade, so tiny, just a minuscule flash in the dim light, and he sliced across the throat of the first guard. Arterial blood arced across the cell, spattering against the wall. The guard gurgled and spun on his heel, clutching at his throat. He immediately got in the way of the other guard.
Hit the button!
Reg screamed into Kettinger's ear. Kettinger was baffled for a moment, stunned, unable to move. Then he realized he had the electricity belt remote in his hand. He hit the button, and the sound of electricity filled the air. King let out a scream and fell to his knees in the cell. His lips were pulled back from his teeth, and his hair stood on end. Despite this, he did not fall unconscious, and his eyes remained frustratingly aware. The sound of electricity continued on and on as Kettinger held the button. King finally relaxed, slumping to the floor. Kettinger released the button. King leaped to his feet immediately. Reg ran into the cell and took the man at the chest, hoisting him into the air like he was nothing and tossing him into the corner of the cell. King collided with the stone wall, the air rushing out of his lungs in a rush, and then collapsed onto the bed. Reg stepped forward and clubbed King across the head with his gun, and King fell sideways at the head of the bed. Dr. Lewiston was now on his feet. Blood ran from his nose, and in his hand was a scalpel. He swung his arm and stabbed the nurse nearest to him. The blade sank into her chest, and blood flowed down her white uniform. With a soft sucking sound, Lewiston removed the blade and swung at the other guard, slicing open the man's arm.
All hail Dalton King!
Lewiston screamed. Reg turned in one fluid motion, reaching out with the hand that held the gun, and sent a single shot into Dr. Lewiston's head. The man's head vanished in a red spray, and bone, brains, and everything else splattered against the wall behind him. Dalton King rocketed off the bed and took Reg in the back, right at kidney level. King's head was bloody, and it ran in rivers down his face, but his eyes still held that wild look, still looked far too alert for a man who was supposed to be drugged, thrown around his cell, and who had taken a blow to the head. Reg and King tumbled to the ground. Reg's gun went clattering across the cell floor. King rained down a flurry of blows to the back of Reg's head. Kettinger finally moved and ran into the cell. King looked up and smiled, dodging out of the way of Kettinger's attempt to grab him. The man rolled across the floor and then grabbed the gun that Reg had been holding. In one motion, he raised it and fired twice into Dix. Dix hadn't moved an instant since this had all started. 2 fountains of blood erupted from Dix's chest, and the man's eyes went wide. Then he fell straight down. King whirled, aiming the gun at Kettinger. Kettinger froze, feeling that his life was over in a matter of seconds. He opened his mouth to say something, but his mouth was dry, and he couldn't find the words. King smiled. Then 2 more guards descended from outside the cell. One of them had a taser and blasted both of the darts into King's chest. The other one had a baton out and clubbed the terrorist on the back of the head. Then the taser went off, sending out large clicks and filling the air with the smell of ozone. King collapsed to the floor, letting out strangled cries as the voltage clamped his jaws shut. He spasmed over and over again on the floor, his back arching, and then he curled into a fetal position, just to jackknife back into an arch-backed position. When the taser finally went off, smoke rose from King's shirt. 2 more guards came into the cell. The 4 guards now in the cell grabbed King and got him onto the bed. They then strapped his straitjacket back on and added shackles to his feet that clamped to metal rings set in the wall behind the bed. Hands grabbed Kettinger by the arms, and for a moment he tried to fight. Then he realized it was Reg, and he let the man haul him to his feet.
That was brave, boss,
Reg said into his ear.
It was also pretty stupid. You could have got yourself killed.
I know, Kettinger replied. I'm not too bright. Kettinger pushed past Reg and walked over to the bed. To his surprise, King was awake and smiling at Kettinger. Blood ran across the man's face, soaked his pillow from the blow to the back of the head. "There's nowhere for you to go," Kettinger said. "You're hundreds of feet underground, and there are hundreds of armed men in that hallway. What did you think you were going to accomplish?" King's smile got wider, blood running over his teeth and gums. "Gotta put on a show, mate. What would the world say if they knew I came into the cell like a lamb? I'd take as many of you with me as what I do. All part of the show." King laughed. If this had been any other place but where they were, and had they been under any circumstances than what they were, his laugh might have been pleasant. Again, like so much else of this man, his laugh was normal. "No one's ever going to hear about this," Kettinger said. "The show is over." King's smile faded. A look of comprehension crossed his face. "You can't," he said. "You have to. Down here, I make the rules, King," Kettinger said. "Nothing gets out of here without me saying what the real story is. Nothing happened here today except for an orderly transfer of a prisoner." Kettinger smiled, and then he leaned forward and punched King in the nose, sending a fountain of blood across the man's face and shirt. King sputtered and spat blood. Then he began straining against his restraints. "You can't do that!" he screamed. "People have to know! They have to know!" Kettinger turned and left the cell. More guards entered after him to remove the bodies. Kettinger did not look at his men as he walked past. The investigation happened fast. The soldiers and remaining medical personnel were shown out of the hive as fast as possible. Kettinger soon had a report out to the press that everything had gone as planned. He told the real story to the top brass at Gemini, and they agreed to go along with the officially published story. Dix's funeral would be covered by Gemini, as would the funeral of the guard killed in the hive. Of course, it was all back to Lewiston. He was one of King's disciples. How he had managed to get himself onto this medical team for the transfer was not known and may have never been discovered. It might have just been blind luck. Lewiston had been treating King before the transfer, giving him a medical examination and medication for King's reported headaches, and maybe King had just converted him then. King had not been under heavy sedation. He had been out, but pretending most of the time. Exactly what the point was, of course, was really not something that could be understood. King sowed terror everywhere he went, and to prove that the most secure prison in the world was not as secure as people thought might have been his goal. Getting the other prisoners riled up to riot might have been another goal. The full scope of his situation might have been unknown even to King. 4 wounded, 1 nurse dead, Dix dead, a guard dead. It was not a good day, but it could have been worse. Had King gotten out of that cell with his gun, who knew how many more he might have been able to take out? Kettinger had funerals to plan, but one thing was for sure. King was to remain locked down for the foreseeable future. He would remain chained to the wall, in his straitjacket, until Kettinger determined that he was no longer a threat. He would not be allowed out of his cell and allowed no contact with anyone. Food would be passed through the food slot, but no guard was to talk to him. 1 guard was to be stationed outside the cell door, and there would be 1 guard to watch him electronically 24 hours a day. If he did anything that looked suspicious, the guards had authority to fill the cell with gas. It was the first fatality since the prison had opened. Kettinger gave a eulogy to the grieving family and the guards. All of the guards were dressed in their best. Kettinger got choked up halfway through. They were all so close down here beneath the surface. This was family. The body was cremated, the ashes given to the family to do with as they wanted. Burials were limited to a very small section outside of Hive City, but only of ashes. There just wasn't room to bury coffins and whole bodies. It took weeks, then months, but things eventually got back to normal. King became something that was forgotten, lost in his cell, far below. You've been listening to When the Night Comes Out, The Hive. Tune in next time for The Hive, Part 3. Written by Brian W. Alaspa. Narrated and produced by Ali James. Music by Vivek Abhishek. Catch up on the first 4 seasons of When the Night Comes Out now. Support us on Patreon for more terrifying content.